Well, hello subscribers, welcome back again. I'm Sarah Payne and I'm going to show you how to make one of my favourite blocks actually, and it is so much my favourite that it featured on the inside cover of my first book. There we go. The actual one is behind me here. But what I actually love so much about this particular block is it's very simple to make, and you're going to use some of the skills that you've picked up already through your subscription with earlier blocks. But once you've made your blocks, when you decide what size quilt you want to make it in, there are lots of different potential layouts that you can use. Obviously, there is the one that's behind me on the wall, but here are just 3 more that you can use with this particular block. It's a really simple block to make, but it's really good fun. So when it comes to your fabric, you're going to need what I call a background fabric. So in this case, it is the white. This is the block here. So if I pick out, that's the block that we're going to be making. All right, so it's a 9 patch. We have the white, which is your background. We have this blue that continues through that we call the contrast, and then a selection of other colours which will eventually make up that entire block. It looks great scrappy, so you can mix in different fabrics. You can use up your stash. That'll be fabulous. That'll work brilliantly. But to hold it together and to get this wonderful shape, get yourself a contrast and a background that are fairly stable so that they don't change too much through the blocks, and you will keep that piece there. Okay, so let's get our bits and pieces together and let's start making. Okay, so let's gather our fabric for our blocks, and this is a great opportunity to use up some of those pre-cuts. So first of all, I have a selection here of fabric strips, the kind you find in your jelly rolls or fabric rolls, depending on where you purchase them. They'll have different names, but these are 2.5 inch wide strips, and you want a selection of these if you're making the whole quilt. Okay, so I have 4 here that we're going to play with for this block. Next, you can grab out your charm packs. Now, charm packs are selections made of 5-inch squares. These are 5-inch squares. You will need a lot the same though, so you'll probably have to cut them. But we're actually going to be making our half square triangles with 2 of the background blocks and 2 of the contrast blocks. Now, technically, when we use this method to create half square triangles, we should be working on 4 7/8 of an inch, but I prefer to work slightly larger, so use 5 inches, a 5-inch square, and then trim it down once we finish. So then if anything is slightly, skew-if, we can sort that out by trimming it later. So for one block, I need 2 of my contrast, 2 of my background. So I'm going to take these 2 and put them right sides together. So right sides means the fabric side. So this is the pattern side or the pretty side. I'm going to put them right sides together, and then I'm going to draw a diagonal line straight the way across my paler fabric. So from one side to the other. The ruler I've just randomly picked up isn't quite long enough, but I can see there, so I can move my ruler along. And there we go, we have a diagonal line. And I'm going to do the same with the other pair. Now this is a white on white fabric, which means it's got a white pattern on it. But you do need to keep an eye on these white on whites, because sometimes it's easy to not notice when you put them on backwards. So line that up, draw a line from corner to corner. This is then going to make the 2 sets of half square triangles that we need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my sewing machine. I'm going to set my machine up for 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch either side of that first drawn line. So if you're not sure about this, you can add a ruler on top and just draw that line in, but lightly. because you don't want that to show through the fabric. This centre line won't show through the fabric because you're going to cut that. But we will now sew along that line and then do the same on the other side. So we're 1/4 inch either side of the blue line, and we'll do that on both pairs. So there we go. You can see I've stitched with them in a grey so that you can see those stitch lines. I would suggest that you stitch them in a lighter colour, a lighter grey. But now we're going to cut along that blue centre line. You can do this with a pair of scissors or with a rotary cutter. And then when we open that up, I'm just going to finger press. You'll see we have a half square triangle. There's another one. And then we need our other two for this block. And we have our 4 sets. I'm just going to give these a quick press, pressing the seam underneath that dark side, and then we'll be ready to trim our block. So here we are. I've pressed all of our blocks and they should finish to 4.5 inches. But as I said, I've made mine slightly a smidge larger so that I can trim down if I need to. So you can see just around the edge of this, if I just move those out of the way, I've got a 4.5 inch square ruler here. So it's quite useful to have a smaller ruler in your stash. But if I place the diagonal line across the diagonal line of my ruler, you can see there's a little extra all the way around. I'm going to trim that off. So I'm going to press that down, get my rotary cutter, and then cut off 2 bits. Oh. Okay, and then turn that round and trim the other way. So you always want to make sure though that your diagonal line on your block is sitting on the diagonal line of your ruler, so then your points will all end in a tip of your half square triangle. So there we go, there's one. See, I'm not trimming much off, but it just means you can see when I lay it on there, they're not quite square. And I've also got these little, sometimes they're called dog legs or dog ears, hanging off the edge, and this trims them off at the same time. So I'll just continue and trim the others. And there we are. You see there's that little bit that we've trimmed off, but I believe that it's better to trim off because, or better go a little bit larger, because it's easier to trim off than it is to add on. So we're going to put those to one side, and then we'll begin working with the little 4 patches using these pieces here. So now we're going to start preparing our little 4 patches. Now to do that, we're going to take our strips, and I'm going to put 2 of them right sides together. So right sides are the fabric sides. We're not going to need a huge amount for these blocks, so 4 strips will be plenty. Right, so those are now right size together. When you're working, incidentally, with a fabric roll or a jelly roll, it's a good idea to get your ruler out and measure where the 2.5 inch point actually is, because some fabric companies will measure the 2.5 from the outside, so from the very edge of the serrated, and some will measure it from the base of the serrate. So it's a good idea to have a look. But we're going to be trimming these anyway. But for these ones, it's actually the base. If you think of this as a mountain, it's actually the bottom of the valley. To the bottom of that valley is your 2.5 inches. Then I'm going to get the other ones. This is just a quick method of making a little four patch without having to cut little tiny squares and sew them all together. So I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down each side of these strips, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to put them together. So here are our strips that we've sewn together, and I've pressed them to the darker side of each of these patterns. So that one I've done behind the pink peacock, and this one I've done behind the line. So what we're going to do now is get our trusty 4.5 inch ruler back again. It does help if you've got the right sized ruler, but if you're using a larger ruler, it really doesn't matter. You can do exactly the same thing. So it just makes it a little more manageable. If I get my other big ruler, there we go. You see, we can use the bigger ruler as well. It's really what you've got in your stash. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to place it on the middle line so that I've got a 2.25 inch mark on that particular ruler. And the reason for that, but you might be able to see it a little better with this large one as well, is that it's going to help me keep this centre line straight when I'm trimming, because tops and bottoms can move, but we need the middle to stay true. So I've got little lines on here at my 2.25 inch. You can see it matches with the top and the bottom, and I'm going to trim off the waist first of all. There we go. So now we're going to rotate it, and I'm going to trim with a 2.5 inch line along the edge of the fabric, and with that 2.25 line running through this centre. If I get to a point where that's no longer central like that, we can just trim the excess off and go straight back to our square edge again. So we'll line that up, and I need 5 sets of these pairs from each of my 2 strips. So line that up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's from 1. So if you're mixing up your colours even more than I am, I'm just using 4 strips, but you could be using a lot more different sort of strip combinations. You will need for each block 10 sets in total. So let's cut the other. Again, I'm going to lay this flat to get my straight end. One, 2, oh, 3, 4, 5. All right, so all my waste is over here, but actually if we were making the whole quilt, this would just be more for another block. So what we're going to do now is take our fabrics and pair them up. So because I've got 4 sets here, I can match them up so that they're the same, or I could have this one on that side. So I've got different opposites. I could play around with it. It's really up to me. The joy as well of pressing the seams in opposite directions means that here there's 3 layers of fabric and this side there's only 1. If I take this piece and I put that together, there's 3 layers there, 1 there, and that means that I can actually push them into each other. I'm pulling this finger this way and my thumb that way, and I'm pushing them as I squeeze to lock in together. If I then clip that, we can actually have a look and see that our seams line up perfectly, because when you're pushing them together, because they're thin one side and thick the other, there's nowhere else for them to go. They have to lock in place. So I will then do that with all of these 5 blocks, and starting from this edge here, so all the way along to that edge there, with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've stitched my 5 blocks together. Here we are. And they should finish. I've also given them a press, by the way. And they should finish at 4.5, the same as our half square triangles. So now we can actually lay our pieces out to create our block, so you can see how it goes together. So there we go. Those are our cornerstones, so that's our 4 patch. And then we take the half square triangle and we're going to place those so that the contrast runs through the middle. It's a good idea to lay it out so that you're sure how everything goes, because it's very easy to do that if you're not paying attention, or even that, and that is a completely different block. If you did them all the same, you'd have an interesting quilt, but you wouldn't have a Jacob's ladder. So we lay those so you can see the contrast runs through the middle, and you see how quickly that has created that iconic Jacob's ladder pattern. So what we'll do now is take one of these squares, place it right sides together with the half square triangle, so with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, open it up, and then do the same this side, and do that on each of your 3 rows, and then press. So here we are. Here's my 3 strips sewn together, and I've pressed them. Now what I've done here, because this is sort of basically a 9 patch, is I've pressed my seams in opposite directions. So for wherever I've got a half square triangle, I've pressed away from that. That means that there's no risk of anything showing through this white. So for this one, the seams have gone that way. For this one, the seams have gone that way. And then for this one, they've gone this way. The good thing about pressing them as well is you can hold them up against each other and see that they do line up. It's very hard to judge that before you've pressed, because all your fabric is a bit sort of bouncy, but it makes it a lot easier when we come to putting it together if we know that these seams actually will line up as they are. So then we take this row and put this right sides together. And I've pressed my seams like I did with this square. I've pressed them in opposite directions so we can put them together with our fingers and push them against each other so that they lock in place. Now with this one, I've actually stitched this with grey so you can see it. So I've got an intersection that creates the point of that triangle, and it's a 1/4 inch from the top. And I want that to match up on both sides. So I'm going to press those together so that they go in opposite directions that way. So the seams go that way and that way. So we'll press that together. What I want to do as well is open it up and have a quick look to see whether that seam there matches up on the other side. So I've had a quick look. I think it does. I'm going to pop a clip in it to the point where the sewn seam would be and then have a look. And you can see there that if I stitch just there, that will line up beautifully. Okay. So right sides together, and then we'll go to the sewing machine and sew across here, and then we would do the same for this piece. Again, lock the seams in that side and pin or clip, and the same here. We want to get that seam matching up, but also we don't want to lose our points. So I would clip it and then take a look. Yes, that one's okay as well. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine, sew these 3 rows together, and our block will be completed. And here we go, our finished block, our finished Jacob's ladder. So to recap, it's made with 4 half square triangles and 5 sets of 4 patches. For that, we used 2 5-inch squares of the background and 2 of the contrast. And then when it was finished, it was sewn together, we trimmed them to 4.5 inches. We also used strips of jelly roll or fabric rolls, sewed them together and then cut them into 2.5 inch wide segments. So when we sewed them together as a 4 patch, they also measured 4.5 inches. And then once we've sewn the whole block together like this, this is now 12.5 inches, like all of the other blocks that you will find in your subscription. And then when that's sewn in with the other ones, they basically finish at 12 inches. And there we go, a beautiful block. Your next decision is how you're going to lay all those blocks together and which of those wonderful design options you're actually going to use when you've got this really strong, definite diagonal line running through your block. As I said, absolutely beautiful and a firm Sarah Payne favourite. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you soon.